Living in Dark Hollow, just a stone's throw from Pittsburgh, was controversial. The place was gorgeous, surrounded by expansive greenery and charming old houses. But heck, having neighbors in the form of the Wards was like living next to horror actors. They were the kind of people who could turn any ordinary day into an episode of The Twilight Zone. At the head of this family was Winston Ward, or Win, as he preferred to call himself. My interactions with Win were mostly during my teenage years. As a young girl, I received special attention from him, which I wasn't happy with. He was overly polite, but in a way that sent shivers down my spine. He seemed to be fake nice, always with some hidden agenda. There were times when I noticed his predatory glances on me, piercing and unadulterated. For example, one day when we happened to be in the same store, he followed me around, coming so close that it made me feel uncomfortable. He even sniffed the air next to me, which was very strange. I remember walking through the store trying to get rid of the unsettling feeling, but in the corner of my eyes I kept feeling his presence. Every time I turned a corner, I tried to get rid of it. But then, after a while, I walked out of the candy department, immersed in thinking about which candy to choose. I forgot about the time for a moment, but as I turned right at the end of the aisle, I almost shrieked in surprise. He was standing next to me, literally a couple feet away, and I was a little shorter than he was, so he seemed to be looking down on me with an unsettling smile on his face. He held his hand behind his back, and I noticed it move slightly. Then he spoke up. "Is this the sweetness you seek?" I was shocked, frozen in place as if rendered speechless. However, I remained polite, not wanting to cause a scene in the grocery store. I mumbled, "Thank you, and hurried away. I ran out of the store as fast as I could, not even daring to look back to see if he was following me. I was left with the feeling that I had just escaped the terrible danger that lurked in the shadows. Ward was strangely courteous to women and girls, but to guys he constituted a nightmare vision. My confrontation with my brother turned into a dangerous situation when his car was smashed with a baseball bat. Win was completely serious. Then a night happened that I still remember with trepidation. I was lying in my room trying to sleep when I heard strange noises outside my window. The shrill scratching was replaced by quiet tapping. At first I thought it was just a tree branch or something, but the sound was too rhythmic, too mysterious. I winced as I lay there listening to this horrible sound that grew more and more intense. Gathering my wits, I peered through the blinds, and what I saw pierced me to the marrow of my bones. A dark figure stood in the courtyard, moving as if seeking entrance. The moonlight was insufficient to discern who it was, but its shape it was too enormous to be an animal. My heart was pounding frantically, and I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to wail, calling my parents for help, but fear paralyzed me. The figure stood there for what seemed like an eternity, and then it just disappeared. The next morning I looked around the street, partially expecting to see footprints or something similar, but there was nothing. It seemed as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that I was vulnerable in my own room. It was one of those moments that stayed with me, making me doubt every creak of the night house. And I certainly knew it was someone from the neighboring family, and that didn't strengthen my peace of mind. Then there was Maggie, Win's wife. She always wore lots of makeup and had dainty eyebrows. One day I stopped by to give them the mail that had been delivered to us by mistake, and she told me the scary origin story of the song, "Ring Around the Rosie." She seemed to enjoy scaring me. Their youngest son, Jacob, was very into Native American culture, but not in a good way. He ran around with a bow and arrow, and some people even claimed to have seen him with real arrows. Yes, he even scared people by showing up with dead animals. Plus, he even got the attention of social workers. Johnny, the eldest son, the Ward, was not quite right. He was the kind of guy who growls at you in the hallways of the school like a wild animal. But the craziest thing he did was something to a girl from our school. She was beautiful and smart. Johnny had somehow unwisely fallen in love with her. He asked her out on a date, but when she turned him down, things went south. In chemistry class, he became sullen and silent while looking at her, to the point where she had to change lab partners, but Johnny didn't settle down. She was driving home from school one night, and in the rearview mirror she saw Johnny sitting in the back seat grinning madly. He was hiding there waiting for her. She was so scared that she lost control of the car and got into an accident, lying in the hospital for a week. And Johnny? He only got a slap on the wrist from the police. No serious consequences. It was crazy. When the for sale sign was finally put up on the Ward's house, relief seemed to finally pass through Dark Hollow. After they were gone, they became more of an urban legend, a story that old-timers tell to scare their friends. It's nice to think that nothing terrible happened while they were here, but who knows what they're up to now. Wherever they are, it's scary to think about. Every time I walk to the store or down the street, I feel like they are still watching me. Even though nothing happened, that feeling never left me. It seemed like their presence left an indelible mark on the neighborhood. Sometimes I casually glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see their dark figures lurking in the shadows. It's a constant reminder of the anxiety they brought into our lives, a feeling that's hard to shake off. I hope to never have to run into this family again. It was an ordinary evening when I first met our new neighbor, Mr. Reynolds. He had moved into the house next door, and my wife and I decided to show our hospitality and invite him over for dinner. We really wanted to make a good impression and get to know the man who would be living next door to us. Mr. Reynolds arrived quickly, and upon entering our home, he smiled warmly at us. This smile seemed rehearsed, as if he was hiding something. Throughout dinner, he was polite and engaged in conversation, but there was a strange emptiness in his eyes. They seemed bottomless, as if he was always distracted by something incomprehensible. Gradually, things became even stranger. Mr. Reynolds began asking personal and intrusive questions, inquiring into the details of our lives. We tried to turn the conversation to other topics, but he persisted in his interest in our personal lives. My wife and I exchanged anxious glances, feeling increasingly uncomfortable in his presence. When dinner was over, we politely asked Mr. Reynolds to leave, and only then did he leave our home. Before he left, however, he handed us a strange gift, an indoor plant. The gesture was unsettling, and I couldn't escape the feeling that he had put an implicit threat in that gift. In the days that followed, I constantly felt that Mr. Reynolds was watching us. I saw him outside my house, just standing there watching our dwelling. It gave me goosebumps running down my spine, and I became increasingly paranoid about our new neighbor. One night I was awakened by a knock on our bedroom window. Cautiously approaching the window, I saw Mr. Reynolds, his face pressed against the glass and his eyes staring intently at me. Trying to get him to leave, I yelled, but he wouldn't leave. He just kept staring, his breath fogging the window. This sinister act is vicious to me, for I felt violated in my own home. The next day, I decided to deal with Mr. Reynolds' behavior and knocked on his door. When he opened, I clearly told him that his actions were unacceptable and he should respect our personal space. However, his response was completely unexpected. Instead of apologizing or acknowledging his intrusiveness, he simply smiled his disturbing smile, stating that he wanted to be a good neighbor and get to know us better. I walked away from his door feeling even more anxious than before. It was obvious that Mr. Reynolds was hiding something, and I didn't know how to deal with it. Weeks went by, and his behavior became more and more erratic. He would leave strange notes on our doorstep with mysterious messages and drawings that made no sense. He seemed to be trying to convey some message to us, but I couldn't figure it out. One night we heard strange sounds coming from his house, whispering and mumbling as if people were gathered in it. It was well past midnight, and we realized that something was wrong. We called the police, and when they arrived, we found a room filled with pictures of our family taken without our consent. Mr. Reynolds was taken into custody, and it was discovered that he had a previous history of stalking and harassment. We narrowly escaped the nightmare, and I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if action hadn't been taken. To this day, I am still haunted by the memory of our chilling encounter with our new neighbor. It was an eerie reminder that danger can lurk very close, hidden behind a facade of politeness and ordinariness. Moving into a new house is always a rather nerve-wracking experience, but my fears were soon replaced by anxiety when I met our neighbor, Mrs. Simmons. She seemed friendly at first, but something about her gave me an inexplicable feeling. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she looked at me for too long. Mrs. Simmons was an elderly woman who had lived alone in the house next door for decades, and her neighbors always thought she was eccentric. Nevertheless, I tried to be a good neighbor and welcome her. But the first strange incident occurred when I was working in the yard. Mrs. Simmons appeared suddenly, her frail body just materialized by the fence. She looked at me with great interest and did not respond to my greeting. She just stood there and watched. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more oddities in her behavior. Mrs. Simmons spent many hours at the window looking out into our yard. At times, I found her standing in the dark in the middle of the night. It gave me the creeps. One night, I decided to visit her and brought freshly baked cookies. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. I figured she wasn't home, so I left the cookies on her doorstep with a note. The next morning, the cookies were gone, but Mrs. Simmons was nowhere to be seen. I figured she liked it, but the uneasiness still remained. It seemed as if she never left the house during the day. One evening, while my wife and I were watching television, we heard a quiet, rhythmic tapping on our living room window. We jumped up and rushed to the window with aching hearts. There in the darkness stood Mrs. Simmons, her wrinkled face pressed against the glass and her eyes staring intently at us. I yelled for her to leave, but she didn't react. She just stood there, tapping her bony fingers on the window in a slow and deliberate rhythm. It resembled a scene from a horror movie. Out of fear, we called the police, who came to talk to Mrs. Simmons. She said she just wanted to meet her new neighbors, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They warned her to respect our personal space and to refuse further intrusions. Things were quiet for a while, and we hoped it was over. But one day, a strange package appeared on our doorstep. Inside was a collection of old photographs. They were pictures of our home, of our family, taken without our consent. We realized with alarm that Mrs. Simmons had been spying on us for a long time. We felt hurt and unsafe in our own home. We called the police again, and they spoke to Mrs. Simmons again, this time sternly warning her of her actions. Months passed, and Mrs. Simmons became increasingly unapproachable. She rarely left the house, and if she did, it was in the evening, under cover of darkness. It seemed as if we were living next to a shadow, a presence that was always hidden and watching. We installed CCTV and took extra security measures, but the feeling of being watched never left us. Our once idyllic new home became a nightmare, overshadowed by a strange and disturbing neighbor. Eventually, Mrs. Simmons died, and the house remained empty for a long time. Everyone in the neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief, but memories of her frightening presence still haunted us. Meeting Mrs. Simmons taught us that sometimes the scariest things can happen in the most ordinary places, and that even behind the facade of ordinariness there can be darkness. My children Sam and Robbie are twin 6-year-olds. A year ago, we were forced to move out of our old house due to unforeseen circumstances. It is an extremely long and horrible story. We lived in the old house for 4 whole years. During that time, I married my wife Carol, and also our home became the birthplace of our children. Unfortunately, our neighborhood began to gradually deteriorate. Despite this, we always intended to stay in this house in the near future until something unforeseen happened. We lived in a corner house, and the house behind ours was surrounded by thick trees and shrubbery, so we almost never noticed our neighbors. However, our neighbor to the right was named Steve. He moved here less than a year ago. I only had a couple conversations with him. Because of his strong accent, I had a hard time understanding what he was saying, and overall, he did not give the impression of being a friendly person. He had 2 windows facing the backyard, but I never saw a light on in them at any time of the day or night. I thought it was a room designated for guests or something like that. One summer, Sam and Robbie were playing in the backyard in the inflatable pool and with water pistols while I was doing yard work. At one point, as I was walking toward the detached garage, I briefly saw Steve through his window in the neighboring house. After a few seconds of noticing him, he turned around and disappeared from view. This struck me as a bit odd, but I disregarded the remark. Later that day, as the sun began to set, the children went outside again to play. The weather was very hot, so they went back to their inflatable pool while I stayed in the kitchen making dinner. A while later, the kids were quiet, and suddenly Robbie came into the house and reported that there was a light flashing in the neighbor's window. Robbie and I went out to the backyard, and I pointed to one of the windows at the top of Steve's house that faced the backyard, and he said that the light was coming through from that window all the time. Instantly, I had a worst guess and asked the twins if it was a camera flash. Both replied that it was. I told them to go back inside. I helped them wipe themselves off, and then Carol and I discussed the case. We immediately suspected the worst. Carol said I should go next door and knock on Steve's door. I did so, but he didn't answer the door. He had his car in the driveway, so it was assumed he must have been home. After several unsuccessful attempts to knock and ring, I decided to go home. I told Carol that Steve wasn't answering the door, which only further reinforced what the kids were saying. Although we had no proof that the white light the children had seen was the resulting camera flash, it looked very much like it, and that was worrying. One night when Carol and I were in the bedroom, we heard a gate quietly opening and closing outside. Carol asked me to check to see what was going on. I went out to the backyard and looked around. Turning on all the flashlights, I started looking, but I didn't find anything or anyone. However, I did notice a light on in Steve's backyard. I walked over to the fence and peered into his yard. I was almost immediately overcome with panic when he came up on the other side and asked if I needed help. I asked him if he had seen anyone sneaking through our yard. He answered in the negative. I also asked if he had noticed anyone watching my children, as they appeared to be having their picture taken while they were playing in the pool. His response was suspicious. He took offense to my question and even started snapping at me for this accusation. I had no proof and didn't want to cause problems with my neighbor, so I apologized and went back into the house. Carol was not happy, calling him a rude person. The next incident happened a few weeks later when we were all asleep. I woke up to Carol's panicked scream shaking me. I looked around the room, a little confused. But as soon as I heard the children's screams from their room, I leaped out of bed and ran down the stairs to the children's room. Roddy woke up crying, and Sammy echoed his cries with his scream. Roddy said there was someone at the window a moment ago, and then there was a flash of a camera. My goosebumps ran and my blood boiled at the same time. I asked what he looked like. Roddy replied that he couldn't see. I took the kids up to our room to sleep next to us. Turning off the light, I looked out of our bedroom window, directing my gaze to Steve's dark house. I looked around every window of his house and spotted him. He, like me, was peeking through an upstairs window in a room overlooking the backyard. I ran outside and knocked on his door several times. He never opened it. I called the police and left a report on Steve. If there are reports from other people in the future, maybe the police will look into it. I never saw him again. Sometimes I would sit near the entrance hoping he would come out, but he always avoided when I was around. So after a month, we moved to a new house in another city. It turned out to be the best place to raise children.